Hello, I'm the awesome Tutor, and today we're going to be looking at Canada, specifically Lord Durham's role in Canada and the publishing of the Durham Report. So, who is Lord Durham? Well, his real name was John George Lambton, and he was born in 1792 and died in 1840 of tuberculosis. Okay? Now, he played a very significant role in drafting the Reform Act in 1832. Now, remember, this was the act that increased the electorate by 60%, allowing more involvement from wealthy businessmen and merchants. And this led to the adoption of free trade. So, Lord Durham had a lot of liberal sympathies, and that affected his political ideology but also his role in Canada. So he was known as Radical Jack. So the appointment of Lord Durham. Now, remember there were two revolts in Canada, one in Upper Canada, one in Lower Canada. In Upper Canada, it was a very small revolt compared to the one in Lower Canada, and it lasted for about a month. Okay, so after the revolt in Upper Canada ended, you had moderate reformers like Baldwin, who commanded or demanded that Parliament pay attention to the problems in Canada and solve them. So you had this guy Melbourne, the Prime Minister, who had a lot of beef with Lord Durham, so he wanted to get rid of him, take him out of the political spotlight. So he sent him to Canada, but little did he know that Lord Durham would be very effective in solving the problems in Canada. So, Lord Durham was appointed Governor General of British North America and High Commissioner to Canada in January 1838. Okay, so he held a high enough position to have a significant impact while he was there. And he launched an investigation into the issues of Upper and Lower Canada. Why were there revolts? Why was there conflict? Why were there tensions? He needed to stabilize the area in order to maintain British control. They did not want a repeat of the American colonies where it led to a war of independence. So what did he do in Canada? Well, he was only there for 6 months, but we cannot assume that just because he was there for a short period of time that he was not able to do as much to have an impact on Canada, because that was not the case. Okay? First thing he did was he replaced the Executive Council with his own commissions and with his own men, headed by members of his entourage like Charles Buller and Edward Gibbon Wakefield. So if you remember, the Executive Council was one of the problems in Canada because there was a political barrier between the Executive Council and the Legislative Assembly. That meant that the Executive Council could do whatever they want, and it was an appointed council. So you had an oligarchy of loyalists, pretty much, and that upset the Canadians because although they could vote for members of the Legislative Assembly, the political barrier between the executive councils and the Legislative Assembly meant that they had no real de facto control over legislation. So, what Durham did is he removed that executive council, replacing it with his own men. And he also had communications with the United States. Okay, he was discussing the rebels in Canada, and he was trying to prevent Americans coming over from the border, um, which would increase agitation and further revolt. So by doing this, he not only established a relationship with the United States, a diplomatic relationship with the United States, but he also was able to limit further conflict and further tensions. So what the US did is they instituted border patrols, and that prevented more agitation. Now, what Durham also did was he established Canada's first police force. So this laid the foundation for more order and stability in the area. He also pardoned the majority of the political prisoners that were arrested after the Upper Canada Revolt. But he sent the most extreme offenders, or the most guilty, to Bermuda. So what this did is it made him very popular among the Canadians, but it had detrimental consequences with his relationship with Parliament because it created a lot of controversy. And so he lacked support in Parliament. There was a debate in the House of Commons. Melbourne didn't support him. Remember, he had beef with this guy. And so this prompted Durham's resignation. They ousted him. So he resigned October 1838, a little bit before the revolt in Lower Canada actually finished. So he published the Durham Report, known as the Report on the Affairs of British North America, in 1839. And what this held was his recommendations of how to solve the problems. He recommended that Upper and Lower Canada be unified into one colony. He recommended that the British Parliament grant the Canadas this responsible self-government which they were demanding, meaning that they would have more autonomy in their legislation and in their day-to-day administration. And Parliament did act on these recommendations, but not very quickly. They did act quickly with the unification recommendation, with the Act of Union, because this would gain them a loyalist majority overall in the colony. I'll explain how that works later. But they did not grant responsible government to all the Canadian colonies until over a decade later. So what was the impact of the Durham Report? What was its importance, its significance? Well, it laid the foundation for Britain's relations with its white settler colonies. Not its other colonies, just its white settler colonies. But it still had an impact, because that meant that Britain now instituted a more devolved form of control, allowing its white settler colonies more autonomy in their affairs. And what that did is it limited further agitation and potential for revolt. Okay, this impact was empire-wide. It removed most of the justification that colonies had for rebellion. Okay, so now they had more autonomy and they were free from the centralized control from the metropole in Parliament. Okay, so yes, it eliminated the root cause of agitation, limiting further revolt, and it stabilized the colony. It led to stability in the Canadas, and it limited dissent and dissatisfaction with Parliament and with the British Empire. Okay, so if you think about this as sort of like diffusion in biology, okay, here you have Upper Canada on the left hand side, and all these little circles represent the loyalists in Upper Canada. Okay, you had a lot of loyalists in Upper Canada with with a small French population, but in Lower Canada, on the right hand side, you had very little loyalists in there. The majority of the population in Lower Canada was French Canadian, and so that meant that the problems in Lower Canada were more profound. And so with the Act of Union combining the two Canadas, you ended up with a majority of loyalist supporters, where they basically diluted the dissenting population that was the French Canadian population. Now with the two Canadas together, you had more loyalists than French Canadians. But what are the limitations of the Durham Report? Well, it had a delayed impact. Okay, it was not applied until nearly 10 years after its publication. Okay, in Nova Scotia in 1848, it was the first time it was applied, the responsible government. And it was not adopted in all the Canadian colonies until 1855, and it was adopted in Australia and New Zealand in the 1850s. So it had a delayed impact, but still an impact nonetheless. But what you have to be careful with is putting too much weight on the Durham Report and on one individual. You have to look at other factors as well. Okay, like the British learning their lessons from the American Revolution, perhaps the argument that this granting of responsible government was inevitable. I mean, it was first suggested by Robert Baldwin, who was a politician in the Canadas before Durham came. So you have to be careful with ending up with a monocausal argument, where you're basically arguing that Durham was the sole man responsible for this impact. Now, you also had Durham's entourage, Charles Buller and Edward Gibbon Wakefield, who were also very important in the creation of the report. As Lord Durham said, Wakefield thought it, Buller wrote it, and Durham signed it. Now, These two served as the conduit of ideas. They were highly significant in the actual creation and drafting of the report. Okay, they were vital in collecting information and data. They did interviews with politicians like Robert Baldwin, who was the first person to suggest that Canada needed responsible self government. And Buller, you see, was the head of many of the administrative commissions that Lord Durham set up after he disbanded the Executive Council. Some of this responsibility was delegated to Wakefield in the bottom right here, but mostly was headed by Buller. So Wakefield concluded that the land tenure system in the Canadas was dysfunctional. It was the root cause of the conflict and dissent in Canada. Okay, but there was no change implemented by Parliament that led to land reform. This shows perhaps a limited role that Wakefield had. Now, what you have to understand is that Wakefield was a known felon. He had numerous sex scandals, one with a 15-year-old girl. So perhaps you could say it was very clumsy of Lord Durham to include in his entourage someone like Wakefield. But Buller was a well-respected politician, and so this gave him more scope to impact on the development of the report. So you could say that Buller held a more significant role than Wakefield. In fact, it was Buller's idea to send some of the worst offenders to Bermuda after Lord Durham pardoned most of the political prisoners. But obviously, this led to the resignation of Lord Durham. So you can't just put all this on one man, okay? He also had help from Buller, from Wakefield, etc. But Lord Durham's role nonetheless was highly, highly significant. His contributions to both domestic British politics and international British politics were unprecedented. So you have to understand that. Okay, Lord Durham fit a muzzle just loosely enough so that they would be content, but just tight enough so that there would be no biting back. Now, this is actually a quote from a very reputable historian, Dr. Elliot Watson. He's actually my history teacher, but he has a lot of published work. If you look on Amazon and search Lord Durham, it's probably going to be the top result under Versus History. He also has podcasts on a variety of historical material, so I really suggest that you check that out on iTunes. Just search up Versus History and you'll find all their podcasts. Okay? This has been the Awesome Tutor. Bye.